January 11th, 1945. In the civilian world, William A. Shomo was a man intimately familiar with the cold, meticulous reality of death. Before the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, Shomo wasn't a thrill-seeking barnstormer or an aristocratic college kid. He was a licensed mortician and funeral director from Jeannette, Pennsylvania. He spent his life preparing bodies for burial, a profession requiring a clinical detachment and an unshakable attention to anatomical detail. When he joined the United States Army Air Forces, the 26-year-old captain brought that exact same chilling, methodical precision into the cockpit. He even painted his civilian trade across the nose cowling of his fighter in bold letters, the Flying Undertaker. But the military didn't assign the Undertaker to a dedicated fighter squadron. They assigned him to tactical reconnaissance. The doctrine for recon pilots was strict and unforgiving. Your film is worth more than your life, and it is certainly worth more than a dogfight. You are the eyes of the Army. Your job is to infiltrate enemy airspace, photograph the targets, and run away. Engaging the enemy is a failure of the mission. The machine the Army gave Shomo to fly was a North American F-6D Mustang. To the untrained eye, it looked exactly like the legendary P-51D Mustang currently dominating the skies over Germany. It featured the massive teardrop bubble canopy, the sleek laminar flow wings, and the roaring Packard Merlin V12 engine. But the F-6D was a highly specialized hybrid beast. Behind the pilot's armored seat, engineers had modified the fuselage to house massive, high-resolution K-24 and K-17 aerial cameras, while other recon aircraft, like the British Mosquito, were completely stripped of their weapons to save weight. The F-6D retained its teeth. It still carried the standard Mustang armament of 6 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns. It was a camera ship that could bite back. Before we follow the Undertaker into a completely unauthorized, mathematically suicidal interception that would earn him the Medal of Honor, I need to ask you a favor. If you believe the unsung tactical reality of these recon pilots deserves to be highlighted over standard Hollywood myths, hit that like button right now. It is the best way to tell the YouTube algorithm that deep mechanical military history matters. Hit subscribe so you never miss a tactical breakdown. And while you're at it, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and whether anyone in your family served in it. We read every single comment to keep these specific, gritty legacies alive. Now, let's drop down to the deck over the Philippines. General Douglas MacArthur's massive invasion force had just landed at Lingayen Gulf. The American brass urgently needed to know how much Japanese air power was hiding in the northern airfields of Luzon, waiting to strike the vulnerable beachheads. Captain Shomo and his wingman, Lieutenant Paul Lipscomb, were tasked with flying north to find out. To avoid the Japanese early warning radar arrays, the two Mustangs flew on the deck, hugging the dense tropical canopy at an incredibly dangerous altitude of roughly 200 feet. At this height, the aerodynamic margin for error is zero. A violent thermal updraft or a momentary lapse in concentration would instantly send a 9,000-pound Mustang plowing into the mahogany trees at 350 miles per hour. They were en route to the target airfields. Their cameras were empty. But as Shomo scanned the morning horizon, his eyes caught a glint of polished aluminum in the sun, about 2,500 feet above them, heading directly south toward the American invasion fleet. Shomo keyed his radio, alerting Lipscomb. Cruising above them was an absolute armada of Japanese aircraft. At the center of the formation was a single twin-engine bomber, widely identified as a Mitsubishi G4M Betty, likely carrying a high-ranking officer or acting as a command ship. But it was the escort that sent a chill down the spine. The bomber was heavily protected by a massive screen of 12 fighters. These were not fragile Zeros. The escort was a mix of Kawasaki K-61 Tonys, featuring liquid-cooled inline engines and heavy armor, and Nakajima K-44 Tojos, stubby, terrifyingly fast interceptors explicitly built to hunt heavy American aircraft. The tactical geometry was a nightmare. 2 heavily loaded reconnaissance planes on the deck against a cohesive formation of 13 advanced enemy aircraft. If Shomo engaged, he would sacrifice altitude, numerical superiority, and his entire recon mission. By every metric of military logic, the Undertaker was supposed to run. But Shomo didn't run. He shoved his throttle past the safety wire into war emergency power, pulled back on his stick, and pointed the nose of his camera ship straight up into the belly of the beast. When a pilot shoves the throttle of a North American F-6D Mustang past the detent and engages war emergency power, the aircraft stops being a reconnaissance platform and transforms into a guided missile. As Captain William A. Shomo and Lieutenant Paul Lipscomb hauled back on their control sticks, ripping their Mustangs away from the mahogany canopy of the Philippine jungle, the massive Packard Merlin V12 engine screamed under the torturous load. Manifold pressure spiked to its absolute mechanical limits, dumping raw fuel and extreme boost into the cylinders. The 2 heavy American fighters surged upward from 200 feet, converting their sheer, low-altitude kinetic speed into a staggering vertical climb. Above them, cruising at 2,500 feet, the Japanese armada was utterly oblivious to the mathematical nightmare rising directly into their blind spot. The Japanese formation was flying in a standard protective screen. The twin-engine bomber held the center, while the 12 heavily armed Kawasaki Ki-61 Tony and Nakajima Ki-44 Tojo fighters flew top cover and flank positions. The enemy pilots were scanning the high-altitude clouds for American interceptors because standard combat doctrine dictated that attacks came from above, out of the sun. No sane pilot would initiate an attack from a massive altitude disadvantage. But Shomo, the former mortician, was executing a perfect anatomical dissection from the 6 o'clock low position. Approaching from below and behind meant Shomo was completely masked by the massive wings and fuselage of the bomber itself. The Japanese tail gunner physically could not depress his weapon low enough to see the 2 Mustangs rocketing up toward his unprotected belly. Shomo didn't fire from a distance. He let the Mustang scream upward, holding his trigger finger steady until the massive cigar-shaped fuselage of the bomber completely filled his K-14 reflector gun sight. He closed the distance to an astonishing point-blank range of exactly 40 yards. Then he clamped his hand down on the trigger. The 650 caliber Browning M2 machine guns mounted in his laminar flow wings erupted, unleashing a synchronized torrent of armor-piercing incendiary rounds. At 40 yards, there was no bullet spread. The concentrated stream of kinetic energy acted like a chainsaw, sawing straight through the bomber's wing root. The high-octane aviation fuel instantly ignited, and the bomber violently detonated in a blinding magnesium-white fire. The massive aircraft folded in half and plummeted toward the jungle below. 1 kill. The 15-minute clock was ticking. The sudden, catastrophic vaporization of the command ship sent the 12 Japanese escort fighters into absolute chaos. The Tonys and Tojos immediately broke their rigid formation, banking wildly to find the attackers. But Shomo didn't stall out after his initial climb. The momentum of the 9,000-pound Mustang carried him straight up through the flaming debris of the bomber and directly into the heart of the frantic Japanese fighter screen. He was now fighting in a phone booth against 12 of Japan's most advanced interceptors. If he tried to engage them in a slow, horizontal turning dogfight, the lighter Japanese aircraft would effortlessly slide onto his tail and rip his unarmored camera ship to shred. Shomo relied entirely on the Mustang's superior energy retention. He wasn't going to turn, he was going to slash. Leveling out of his climb, Shomo instantly locked onto a Kawasaki K-61 Tony that was banking hard to the left. He violently kicked his rudder pedals, skidding the heavy Mustang into a perfectly calculated deflection angle. He fired a 2-second predictive burst into the empty airspace ahead of the turning fighter. The Japanese pilot flew his aircraft directly into a solid wall of American lead. The armor-piercing round smashed through the Tony's engine cowling, instantly shattering the inline block. The fighter snapped violently out of its turn, trailing a massive plume of white smoke, and entered an uncontrollable terminal spin. 2 kills. Off his right wing, Lieutenant Lipscomb was executing the exact same mechanical brutality, ripping into the disorganized swarm and securing his own kills. Shomo hauled back on his heavy control stick, utilizing the Mustang's exceptional high-speed roll rate to flip the aircraft inverted and drop onto the tail of a third Japanese fighter, another K-61 Tony, desperately trying to initiate a dive to escape the carnage. At 400 miles per hour, Shomo wrestled the heavy yoke, fighting the G-forces to keep the gun sight locked. At 200 yards, he squeezed the trigger again, tearing away the enemy fighter's tail control surfaces and sending it plunging into the jungle. 3 kills. And the engagement wasn't even 5 minutes old. But the initial shock was wearing off. The surviving Japanese pilots, realizing they were only fighting 2 American planes, finally stopped running. The stubby, terrifyingly fast Nakajima K-44 Tojo interceptors dropped their noses and began turning the tactical geometry back against the Americans. Shomo was out of surprise, bleeding his airspeed and entirely surrounded. The Undertaker was about to prove exactly how cold his blood really was. In the unforgiving mathematics of aerial combat, momentum is life. When Captain William A. Shomo pulled his F-6D Mustang out of a screaming dive to survey the sky, he had successfully vaporized a bomber and shredded 2 fighters. But his element of surprise was completely spent, and he had bled off a massive amount of his kinetic energy. He was now flying a camera ship in a slow, low-altitude arena against furious Japanese interceptors. The Nakajima K-44 Tojos were reorganized. Unlike the agile but fragile Zero, the Tojo was a dedicated, blunt-nosed interceptor built around a massive radial engine. It possessed a terrifying climb rate and was explicitly designed to hit fast and hard. Seeing the American Mustang bleeding speed, 2 Tojos dropped their noses and initiated a coordinated pincer attack. If Shomo tried to outturn them horizontally, the Tojos would easily slide inside his turning radius. He couldn't outturn them, so he had to outroll them. The P-51 series possessed an exceptional high-speed roll rate. Shomo slammed his heavy control stick hard to the right and kicked his rudder pedals, snapping the 9,000-pound fighter into a violent high-G barrel roll. He intentionally threw his Mustang out of the Tojo's synchronized gun sights, forcing the Japanese pilots to continuously adjust their trajectories. As the lead Tojo overshot his flight path, Shomo instantly reversed his roll, snapping the Mustang back to the left. The violent aerodynamic maneuver crushed him into his seat, but it perfectly aligned his reflector gun sight with the belly of the passing Japanese interceptor. He squeezed the trigger. The 6.50 calibers roared, dumping a concentrated stream of incendiary rounds directly into the Tojo's radial engine. The kinetic impact shattered the cylinders, and the heavy Japanese fighter violently pitched forward, completely losing aerodynamic control before plunging into the canopy below. 4 kills. The sky was an absolute maelstrom of burning aviation fuel and snapping tracer fire. Off his wing, Lieutenant Paul Lipscomb was fighting his own desperate survival battle. Lipscomb was expertly matching Shomo's brutality, securing 3 kills of his own in the swirling melee. The 2 recon pilots were fighting back-to-back, establishing a localized sphere of absolute destruction. But Shomo wasn't finished. A 5th Japanese fighter, another K-44 Tojo, realizing the American was tearing their formation apart, banked hard and came at Shomo in a dead-level head-on pass. Playing a game of aerial chicken is the ultimate test of a pilot's nerve. You were flying directly at a heavily armed enemy at a combined closure rate of over 600 miles per hour. The pilot who blinks and brakes first exposes the unarmored belly of his aircraft to the enemy's guns. Shomo, the former mortician, did not blink. He held his heavy control stick dead steady. He trusted the sheer volume of his .50 calibers over the Tojo's armament. At 400 yards, Shomo opened fire, filling the microscopic airspace between the two aircraft with a solid wall of lead. The Tojo flew straight into the buzzsaw. The American rounds smashed through the Japanese cockpit and engine blocks simultaneously. The Tojo instantly erupted into a fireball, and Shomo had to violently yank his control stick backward at the very last microsecond, his Mustang shuddering as it flew directly through the flaming debris. He was officially an ace in a day. The psychological effect on the remaining Japanese pilots was catastrophic. They had vastly outnumbered two solitary American reconnaissance planes, yet in less than 10 minutes, half their armada was falling scrap metal, their discipline completely shattered. The surviving fighters firewalled their throttles, dropped their noses, and scattered in a desperate attempt to run. But you cannot outrun a Packard Merlin V12 engine in a shallow dive. Shomo shoved his throttle back into war emergency power, pursuing the fleeing fighters with cold, methodical precision. He caught a sixth fighter trying to extend away toward the coast. Shomo calculated the minimal deflection and fired a 2-second burst that sawed the enemy's right wing entirely off. A minute later, he ran down a seventh fighter, hammering its fuselage until the pilot bailed out over the jungle. 7 kills. Suddenly, the sky was completely empty. The roar of the machine guns ceased, leaving only the deep, rhythmic thrum of the Mustang's massive engine. In exactly 15 minutes of hyper-compressed mechanical violence, Captain William Shomo had shot down 1 bomber and 6 fighters. Lieutenant Paul Lipscomb had shot down 3 fighters. Together, 2 lone reconnaissance planes had completely annihilated a 10-plane Japanese attack force. They dropped their Mustangs back down to the deck, hugging the treetops to avoid any further radar detection, and successfully navigated the 200 miles back to base. When the ground crew swarmed the Flying Undertaker, they fully expected the aircraft to be a bullet-riddled sieve, but as they inspected the fuselage, they were stunned. Despite fighting a 6-to-1 disadvantage in a massive furball, Shomo's Mustang hadn't taken a single scratch. The K-24 cameras in the rear fuselage remained completely untouched. For his unprecedented, mathematically impossible 15 minutes of aerial slaughter, William A. Shomo was awarded the Medal of Honor. He remains one of the only reconnaissance pilots in American history to win the nation's highest military decoration for a dogfight. At WWII Frontliner, we don't just recount the dates, we decode the engineering, the physics, and the terrifying human endurance required to master these machines. When the tactical geometry breaks down, survival relies entirely on the cold, mechanical discipline of the pilot in the seat. If Shomo's 15-minute masterclass in energy fighting gave you a new respect for the recon squadrons of the Pacific, crush that like button. It bypasses the algorithm and helps put real military history in front of a wider audience. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you are locked in for our next tactical breakdown. And before you head out, drop into the comments and tell us where you're watching from and whether anyone in your family served in it. We monitor every single comment because preserving these gritty, specific legacies is the entire reason this channel exists. Shomo brought his civilian trade to the cockpit, and the enemy paid the ultimate price. Keep your momentum high, and we'll see you in the next video.